Hi, this is Cappy. I'm from Always in Stitches, and I want to talk to you today about a subject that every stitcher that uses a sewing machine or even with hand stitching has issues with, and that's threads and needles and tension. And so I call this class TNT. Think of the old cartoons with Wile E. Coyote where he had a big bomb that had the words TNT on it and it would explode when he was having a meltdown or whatever. That's kind of what I want you to think of when maybe your sewing machine's not working, even your hand stitching, your thread's knotting and giving you trouble. TNT, when your head's going to explode like a bomb, that stands for thread, needle, and tension. So this is going to be a three-part series. I'm going to start with thread, and it will feel a little exhaustive, but the most important part of your project really is your thread. It's what holds your whole project together, quite literally, whether you're using your sewing machine, whether you're sewing by hand, no matter how you're working with a stitching project, the thread you are using, or the floss, or even the yarn, is what holds it together. So it's the most important part of our project in a lot of ways, but we don't know a lot about thread. So I have a little sheets of paper here that are to prompt me, and when they're interesting enough, Peter's going to kind of focus in on them. We got Peter behind the camera, so shout out to Peter for running the camera for us. So TNT, I want to start. TNT is thread, needle, tension. This is just part one. We're going to talk about thread, okay? That's the first part of our problem. And typically, unless you started in garments, you don't always know a lot about threads. So everybody has a thread collection in their home, for the most part, if they've done any crafting. I have my great-grandmother's thread that's on wooden spools. There's also the collection of thread that's come over the years with my crafting and skills. The difference is all threads are not made the same, and I think that's something that we don't always understand. So there's different kinds of thread. There's metallic thread, there's polyester thread, there's cotton thread. There are so many kinds of thread. There's silk wrap, there's silk finished, there's metallic. There's so many kinds of thread, but for now I'm going to just focus on these three: the metallic, the poly, and the cotton, because typically for quilters, that's the fabric, the fiber we're using with our fabric. There are other choices, but I'm not going to try to address all those right now. So I'm going to start with metallic threads. So metallic threads are wonderful. I think a lot of times quilters are afraid to use them because we don't really know how to use them. You have to use the right needle and you have to have the right tension in order for metallic thread to work. Because if you think about it, it's just a little piece of metal going in and out of your sewing machine. Now, my thread ends up a bundled up mess sometimes because I don't have everything set right. And so I have this pile of thread that's just a nightmare. And that's when my head's doing that TNT that I was talking about, where you want to explode. My goal is to make it so that when you use any kind of thread, whether it's metallic or any other, it doesn't end up in a hot mess, okay? You ready for me to change? Okay. Don't want to go too fast. Okay, so what do you want to consider when you're purchasing metallic threads? So there's different choices when you're buying a metallic thread. You can get, and I'm going to show you some threads that we've got here in the store, the core diameter. And what I'm talking about with that is I've got a couple of threads here. This one is a metallic thread. It has a very large core diameter. So that thread is not going to be really in a loopy loop when I take it off. But this one has a very small core diameter. So when I pull it off on my spool, it's going to be very twisty. It's going to have a lot of tightness to it. Whereas when I pull this bigger thread off, it's not going to be as tight coming off of the spool. It's going to have a bigger, longer space. And that's important to know because if I'm going to thread it through my machine, I have to allow the thread time to open and expand before it runs through the tension disc and runs through the needle. So typically when I am using a metallic thread, I'm going to be sure I use the right needle and I set my tension properly. It's not going to be the same as if I was using a cotton thread. Is it wound too tight? For instance, this thread is wound so very tight on this spool, I might take it off and put it on a bobbin so it's a little more relaxed so that it's had a chance to breathe and open up. And then if it's wound horizontally or if it's round in a crosshatch, So this one you can see it's a crosshatch. The thread goes back and forth against each other, kind of like a figure 8. I can have other metallic threads that are wound a little differently. This one is round just from the top to the bottom in one full round. So I'm going to want to put this on my machine, or actually on a spool pin, something where it pulls up off the top of the thread, where this one, I'm going to want it to come horizontally off the thread. And to show you that, I'm going to use a piece of toilet paper. So this is toilet paper, so you never knew you'd see toilet paper used like this. So, and we had plenty of this, believe it or not. So if I'm pulling my thread off like this, see how it twists? But if I pull it off like this, and this is that debate about forward, backwards, it's going to go flat. So that's part of the process you want to think about when you're pulling your thread off of your spool. This one does a little bit better when it's horizontal. This one, this type, is going to be happier when it's vertical because of the way it twists coming off of the spool. So think of toilet paper next time you're trying to get your thread to behave and go into those tension discs in the needle correctly and not tangling up before it gets in there. Smooth bobbin thread. When I'm working with a metallic thread, if I don't need the metallic on both sides, I'm going to use a very smooth, maybe even a lingerie bobbin thread, so that it gives the metallic thread enough pull to go to the top. That bobbin thread is going to be very light if it's a lingerie weight, and that'll allow the thread to go to the top and see all my metallic work on the top. The back will just kind of have some dimples to it. And then use the correct needle. You're going to need a bigger needle, you're going to need a metallic needle or a titanium needle, and you want one with a big enough bore hole that it can go through correctly. And we're going to talk more about needles. There's a lot to know about needles too. But working with metallic threads, you're going to have to adjust your tension and use the correct needle. So we're going to talk about that in the session 2 and 3. But just to get you know, that's going to be coming up. Okay, so what about type of thread? When it comes to metallics, there's round. This one happens to be a flat thread. There's also different weights of thread. So I can have, this one is actually a 3-ply. So that tells you how many pieces are twisted in there to make the thread. So I can have a 3-ply. See, there's 3 plies in there. You can see 1, 2, 3. And they've also got a little piece of metal in there. So I can have a 3-ply that is a 40 weight, and I can have a 3-ply that's an 80 weight, and the 80 weight thread would actually be thinner even though it's 3-ply because of the number of the thread. So the bigger the number of the thread, let's see if I've got that here. That's coming up. Here we go. Let's put this sheet up. So when you're looking at thread, put that right there so he can zero in on it. The higher the thread number, the thinner the thread. And that's really important when you're selecting your needle, that you get the right thread and the right needle. If I have a thin thread, I need a needle that the eye of the needle is not too big for that thin thread to go through. If I have a thicker thread, I need an eye of the needle big enough to allow that thick thread to go through. So for instance, I'm working with a metallic thread and it's just shredding like crazy. I would first check to see what my needle size is. It could be too big because the thread wiggles all around in the hole that's the eye of the needle and that makes it break apart. Or it could be too small and the thread can't get through the hole, so it's pushing through. So I need to look at the size of my needle and make sure I'm matching my thread. This piece of thread here is super, super thick. I don't know if you can see it, but it's really, really thick. This thread, which is also a metallic, is super, super thin. One's thick, one's thin. I'm going to use completely different size needles. They're both metallic threads, but different size needles. Okay? So you're going to have to be sure which style of thread. You need to know if it's round or if it's flat. Sometimes your decorative threads are flat instead of round. You have to allow for that in your needle space. And the weight and then the ply of the thread. Had no idea you'd think this much about thread. But don't be afraid to use metallic threads. Honestly, they're so much fun, and they're great for finished quilting, even just a little bit of pizzazz in your quilt. If you don't use them with your sewing machine, you can use them by hand. Embellishing your quilts is really what brings them to the next level. So I always encourage people, don't be afraid to use metallics or the decorative threads. There's so many out there anymore. They come in like, here's some purple we got in that I'm just in love with. It's called Dazzle, Razzle Dazzle, Sizzle. Sizzle, Razzle Dazzle, all these fun names. Look at these colors. They just scream, put me in a quilt. Make me do something fun. Top stitching, finished quilting, whatever you want to do with it. Okay? Oh, here's some silver too. So wouldn't that be great for a Christmas project? If I put a little bit of Christmas thread, did a Christmas tree or a table runner, and then just did some top stitching with some of this beautiful thread. I'm going to use a big needle in this because it's very big thread, but it can be done. Don't be afraid. Okay? So that's metallic thread. Now I'm going to talk about cotton thread. This is probably the one that's most familiar to our quilters. Cotton has been kind of the thread to use since the beginning of time. We've seen cotton thread forever. I have tons of wooden spools filled with cotton thread that I adore, but I don't use it. You wouldn't want to put that ancient thread into a project because the stability of that thread is probably not very good at this point in time. Cotton is one of the most stable fibers in that it will hold its condition very, very well, but it has to be in the proper climate, the proper humidity, the proper temperature. I can guarantee you my grandmother's wooden spools of thread were not kept in the proper temperature and all those things. So I have those threads, I have them on the shelf, I love them, I look at them, but I'm not going to use them in anything that I want to have as an heirloom. The same goes as cotton thread that's maybe not the best quality. There are a lot of cotton threads on the market, and you can have a lot of debates over what you prefer. In our particular store, we like to use the Aurifil threads, and that has to do with the fact that they are really good about marking their labels about what they have on the spool. So, I gotta find my Aurifil thread. This is some of the various sizes of Aurifil. They're all color-coded, which I love. Depending on the color of the spool, I can tell the size of the thread. And so that makes it really simple for me to grab a spool of thread and know what I'm working with. So the orange threads, or the orange spool, is typically what we're using in our store. And it works great for embroidery, it works great for hand sewing, it works great for standard quilting. Matter of fact, they call this, and it's an Italian thing, I think, they call it an embroidery thread, but embroidery is the term not just for embroidery machines, but just for the way it's sewn. And I can't get this open. Oh well, anyway, that's what it is. So cotton, let's talk a little bit about where cotton comes from. When you're looking at your cotton threads, there's this myth about Egyptian cotton. You know, I buy Egyptian cotton sheets. I buy Egyptian cotton is the premier cotton. And if every stitch of cotton in the world that I ever bought was Egyptian cotton, man, Egypt is making a lot of cotton. I mean, wow. You think of all the cotton that goes into quilting fabric, into garments, into bed sheets. That's huge. But always Egyptian cotton is kind of the standard. It's sort of like when you buy a tissue, it says Kleenex on the box. They're not really Kleenex, they're tissues, but we call them Kleenex. So Egyptian, there's a myth that all cotton that's Egyptian is better. Well, here's the truth. There's 114 million bales per year of cotton produced in the world. In China, there's about 26%, India 23%, United States 16%, Pakistan, Brazil, it goes on. Egypt only does 0.0005% of the total cotton produced in the world. So how am I buying Egyptian cotton in everything I buy? Well, Egyptian has become a term to explain the quality of the cotton. And some of that Egyptian cotton may very well come from Egyptian seeds, just like Cuban cigars come from Cuban seeds, but they're not actually, well, I mean, you don't plant a seed and a cigar grows, but you use Cuban tobacco, and then that grows your tobacco. But what they're talking about with Egyptian cotton is the staple thread length, and it is the word staple. It's not stable, it's staple. And this has to do with how long the cotton fibers are in a cotton boll. So if you've ever seen cotton growing in the South, it comes in these big white balls. And depending on the quality of the cotton ball determines the length of the fiber within the cotton, because it's a natural fiber. The longer the fiber in the cotton, when they spin those together to make their thread, the sturdier the thread is. So if I have a short cotton staple, it's not going to be very strong. But if I have long cotton staples that are wound together, it's good quality thread. So that's what you're looking for, is a good staple length. Most of your cotton are not going to tell you the staple length, but just so you understand the mechanism behind what we're talking about, that's how we choose. So what I want to find in a good quality cotton thread is a long staple. I want a polished or a silk finished. And what that means is, in the process of finishing the thread, they have, it's really kind of cool, Google how to finishing thread, but they run it actually through a little machine that's kind of like flames almost, that come up and burn off the little fuzzes part on the fiber, because cotton is a fiber, and you want the smoothest, silkiest thread you can possibly get. I can take some other brands of thread besides Orifil and look at the actual thread itself, and it's fuzzy. And where do you think that fuzz goes when it's not on the piece of thread or in your product? It's in your sewing machine, and that's not a good thing. So we want to get the cleanest possible thread we can afford. We want precision dyed. That has to do, especially with variegated threads. A precision dyed thread will have a consistent color pattern where it repeats red, blue, yellow, green, and they're all equal lengths, and they're all consistently the same color repetitively. That helps with your tension, because different color thread has different tensions, especially in cotton. So if I can get one that stays fairly consistent with how it changes color, my tension is going to be a little easier to set. So get the best quality you can as far as the dyeing process in the thread. And the nice thing about this thread, this is made by Superior Threads, this actually tells me inside the needle they recommend. It also tells me the size, the weight, all kinds of good information on this. So I like inside there, you can see, it gives me data. That's what I want. I want to buy a thread that tells me all about the thread.
Turn it 180.
There you go. Now you can see the bottom button. Superior Threads does a nice job. They put out some good threads. And then here's your Orifil bottom end. You can see that this says 50, it says Mako 50. That's the gram weight. Or that's the, well, it actually is a gram. There's this big long formula that would bore you to death that tells you how to figure out the weight of thread, but it has to do with how far it goes in a mile and blah, blah. Anyway, and then always pick the proper weight for your project. So if I'm working on handbags, for instance, I make a lot of handbags. I often use an upholstery weight thread, what would be considered an upholstery weight, which is like a 40 weight thread, making bags, because they got to hold up to that durability. But if I'm piecing a quilt, I'm going to use maybe a 50, 60 weight thread. If I'm doing top stitching, I'm going to go back to that 40 weight. I want something that really shows off my top stitching and my finishing work. I took the time to do it. By golly, you're going to look at it. I'm going to use a big honking thread so you know I did it, okay? But that's your choice. There's no right or wrong. Choose what you like. For piecing, stitching seams together, I want something that melts. So I'm going to go 50, 60, 80 tiny things that will melt into the fabric for the thread weight. Because remember, the higher the number, the thinner the thread. Keep remembering that. That's very confusing later when we talk about needles. So let's talk a little bit about polyester. Polyester gets a bad rap too. And you're going to have to go close on this picture because this makes everybody laugh. I think I dated him in high school. Or maybe went to the senior prom or something with this guy. But anyway, it was just a stock photo. Only kidding. There's nobody out there going to be mad at me. But here's the truth. Polyester thread gets a really bad rap from quilters. They'll be like, well, I'm not going to put polyester in my cotton project. Okay, you don't have to. That's cool. I get it. Yeah, Peter's raising his hand. We had this discussion this morning. Polyester is a good product to use in a cotton quilt. I'll say that too much, people will be freaking out. But let me tell you why it's a good product to use. If I'm giving a quilt to a new mom who has a baby and she is going to wash that quilt till the day comes home that that kid gets back from college, I'm going to want some polyester thread in that because it's going to withstand the wash and wear and tear in a way that's a little different than a cotton thread. Cotton and polyester are arguably equally, if not cotton sometimes even considered stronger than polyester, but for color fastness, for durability, polyester kind of does get cotton beat a few times. There used to be, and here's your myth thing, there used to be this thing where they said, oh, you can't use polyester in your quilts because it'll rip the quilts apart. Well, there's a big difference between the way Grandma quilted and the way we quilt. Hand stitching and stitch in the ditch was notoriously the way we did quilts. And I've got a quilt behind me right here that was actually hand stitched. And you can see it's kind of thin in places, and it's just handled differently. The needles were bigger, the stitches were a little different, and so polyester, especially when it's running along a seam line, will weaken an area that's already weak in the quilt. Now this one they cross-hatched, but a lot of times in these older quilts they did stitch in the ditch. Well, think about the ditch of a quilt. In the ditch of a quilt, you've already got holes you made when you sewed it together. Now you're putting another set of holes right beside it so that you can put this top stitching on. And the thread and the quality of the fabric, let's face it, they were feed sacks a lot of times, is not the best. So it doesn't withstand the repeated stitching. And when polyester came out in the early 20s, 30s, 40s, right around in that era, depending on who you talk to, but when polyester threads started being available on the market, those traditional quilters said, oh no, you can't use that, you have to use cotton. It's just like our hand quilters who sometimes look down their nose a little bit at our machine quilters. It's not right or wrong. Nobody's doing anything bad here. It's your craft. It's okay. So I'm giving you permission to use polyester in your quilts. It's not a bad choice. Now we do machine stitching. We do all over quilting. We have an improved fabric quality. So using a polyester thread is really not a problem. It does create a different finish. It's not going to shrink the same way cotton does. I personally like my quilts to look a little scrunched up like old quilts, so I never wash my fabric first. I make my entire product and then I wash it so that it gets that aged look to it. That happens because of shrinkage in the threads and in the fibers. You won't get that with polyester thread in the same way, okay? It doesn't shrink, which is actually a good thing. When, as I said, I'm thinking about those new moms with blankets and things. Maybe they don't want to have to deal with that. So why would I choose polyester? Well, it's color fast, first of all. Cotton thread is going to fade at a similar rate that your cotton fabric will, which is appealing. But if I don't want the color to fade, for instance, if I'm doing an embroidery project, if I'm doing top stitching, maybe I want to use polyester. It's easily washed and dry clean. Again, it's that wash and wear feature that we love about the poly threads. It does not absorb moisture in the same way. So if I'm working on an outdoor project, say I'm making a quilt to put on my back patio to have for my by my fireside, you know, if I'm doing fires, have bonfires, and I want a quilt that I can have outside and bring it in and out. It's going to be subject to moisture, so I wanted a little resistance. Polyester retains its shape in a different way than cotton does. Cotton will adapt to whatever you sew it into. Polyester is going to retain the shape that it was in before. And it's strong. Polyester does have a strength quality that can be very attractive depending on the project you're working with. Okay, that's polyester. So how do I choose polyester? Same way you choose your cotton or your metallics. Check the hang test. When I open up that spool, is it wiggly? Do I need to consider how I'm going to set it on my spool vertically or horizontally? Do I need to open it up a little bit and let it breathe? Because a lot of times when our threads are getting tangled up, it has to do with there's not enough space from when it comes off the spool to when it gets to the needle. That's why it goes all the way through all those places on your sewing machine, is so that that thread can open up and not have this twist on it. We sell thread stands, which I highly recommend. You can just set your thread kind of aside your machine. It runs up a pole and comes across and down in. If you're having thread issues bunching up, a thread stand's a great choice. Okay, cheap trick, free. This is easy. You can also just set it in a coffee mug and pull it off and just let it sit in the coffee mug and spin. That works too.
With coffee or without?
Without. You could put, well, you could, but no, not with coffee. That's a bad thing. Okay, and then I'm going to ask the same questions that I have with my cotton poly every thread. What's the weight? What's the ply? That's determining the thickness and how I'm going to set my tension discs when I get ready to work with the thread. So picking any thread, polyester, metallic, or cotton, these are the questions you want to ask yourself every time you purchase it. Oh, we're going to move into needles, but I want to say a couple more things about thread. The other thing is I want you to buy the best quality thread you can afford. Here's the truth. Not everybody's working on a project that's a family heirloom thing that you need to buy thread that's fairly expensive. I will tell you the Aurifil thread that we sell, when you price it out per yard, it's cheaper than most of your other threads. So it's a good investment for your money. But I'm going to tell you, buy the best possible thread you can afford. Go to your local quilt shop. Find out what their favorite thread is. We all have our darlings, the ones we love, and that's the kind of thread you should be buying regardless of what project you're working on. So this is going to conclude the first of our 3 videos. The next thing I'm going to talk about needles, and I don't want you to be afraid, but we're going to talk real seriously about how to use a needle and make sure it works well for your project. So thanks for watching number 1.